My name is Claire Dawson. My mother-in-law once looked me in the eye in front of a table full of relatives and called me a freeloader. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of family dinner my husband's side insisted on having at least once a month. The air in the dining room was thick with the smell of roast chicken and rosemary potatoes, but even stronger was the tension that seemed to coil like a spring whenever my mother-in-law's eyes landed on me. I had learned to keep my head down during these dinners, offer polite smiles, ask harmless questions, and avoid drawing attention to myself. But that night, she decided to make me the center of attention. Well, she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the chatter. It's a good thing Michael makes enough money to support extras. Her eyes flicked to me like a dagger finding its target. The room went quiet. Forks froze midair. I felt every pair of eyes shift in my direction, waiting to see if I'd respond. My husband Michael didn't look at me. He just stared down at his plate, cutting his chicken into pieces so small they could have fed a bird. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said softly, keeping my tone even. I'd learned from experience that meeting her aggression with defiance only made her dig deeper. "Oh, don't play coy, dear," she continued, setting her wineglass down with a thud. "You work a few hours a week at that little community place, and the rest of the time you're at home, living off my son. When I was your age, I was raising children and running a household without asking for help." I could feel the heat rise to my cheeks, a mix of humiliation and anger. Yes, I worked part-time at the community center, but what she didn't know, because I never told her, was that I also freelanced from home, quietly contributing to the bills and saving what little I could for our daughter's future. I looked at my plate, fighting the urge to defend myself. Not because I thought she was right, she wasn't, but because I knew it would be pointless. She'd already decided who I was, a woman taking advantage of her precious son. The worst part, Michael still said nothing. It's strange how silence can feel louder than words. His refusal to speak up for me hurt more than her insult. I could have handled her sharp tongue if I knew he was in my corner, but his silence made me feel exposed, unprotected. I excused myself from the table a few minutes later, claiming I needed to check on our daughter who was playing in the living room. My hands shook as I walked away, not from fear, but from the effort it took to hold myself together. Our daughter Emily was building a tower of blocks on the carpet. She looked up and smiled at me, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the other room. I sat down beside her, grateful for her innocence, and tried to push my mother-in-law's words out of my mind. But they stuck like burrs in my skin. That night, lying in bed beside Michael, I waited for him to say something, anything, that might ease the sting. Instead, he rolled over and muttered, "You know how she is. It's not worth getting into it." I turned to face the ceiling, my eyes tracing the faint patterns of light from the street lamp outside. It wasn't worth getting into it for him, maybe. But for me, it was different. For me, her words were a branding iron marking me in front of everyone as someone who didn't pull her weight. I made a quiet vow to myself in that moment. I wouldn't let her words define me. And one day, whether she knew it or not, she would see exactly who I was and what I was capable of. That vow stayed tucked in the back of my mind, quiet but unshakable. At the time, I thought it would be years before I had the chance to prove her wrong. I didn't know that life was about to hand me that chance far sooner than I expected, and in a way, none of us could have predicted. It's funny how the seeds of change often get planted in the middle of humiliation. You don't see them at first. You just feel the sting, the ache. But under the surface, something begins to grow, slow, steady, patient. And one day, it breaks through. That Sunday night, as I lay in the dark, I had no idea that the next time my mother-in-law looked at me with those judging eyes, it would be from a hospital bed, and everything between us would be different. If you want, I can move straight into part 2, so we keep the emotional momentum building. Ban Janoi. Continue, ChatGPT. Janoi. Part 2. The week after that dinner, I carried my mother-in-law's words with me like an invisible weight. It wasn't just the insult, it was how familiar it felt. Over the years, her comments had been small, almost sly at times. Must be nice to have so much free time when she caught me reading in the afternoon. I wish I could work part-time, as if my reduced hours were a vacation instead of a necessity to be there for Emily. I told myself I wouldn't let her get to me, but even the strongest skin feels the sting if you keep pricking it. My routine was a constant juggle. I worked mornings at the community center organizing charity events, teaching computer basics to seniors, and setting up food drives. In the afternoons, I came home, helped Emily with her schoolwork, cooked, cleaned, and later sat down with my laptop to work on freelance projects. The money I earned this way wasn't huge, but it paid for groceries, Emily's school trips, and the quiet savings account I kept under my name. And I never asked Michael for a cent. But I never told him or anyone else exactly how much I contributed. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want the inevitable questions. Michael came from a family where the man's income was seen as the main pillar, the wife's as extra. If I admitted that my earnings were sometimes the thing holding us steady, I wasn't sure how he'd take it, or how his mother would twist it. One Thursday afternoon, I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when Michael came home early. He leaned against the counter, his tie loosened, a faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to him. "She's been talking again," he said without preamble. I froze for a moment, knife midair. "Who you know who?" His eyes darted to the window as if the trees outside might offer him an escape from the conversation. "She said she's worried you're putting too much strain on me, that maybe you should, you know, pick up more hours." I set the knife down slowly. "Is that what you think?" He sighed. "I think she just doesn't get it. But maybe if you worked more it would ease her mind." I let out a humorless laugh. "Ease her mind, or make her stop embarrassing you in front of your family." His jaw tightened. "I'm just saying." "No, Michael," I cut in. "You're just avoiding taking a stand." He didn't answer. He just grabbed a drink from the fridge and left the kitchen. That silence between us was louder than any fight. The next few days, I threw myself into my work at the community center. We had a big winter coat drive coming up, and I was knee-deep in donated jackets and piles of scarves when my coworker Janet noticed my mood. "You've been quieter than usual," she said, sorting gloves into boxes. "Just family stuff," I replied. She gave me a knowing look. Family can be the hardest people to convince you're doing your best, but you can't run yourself into the ground for their approval. Trust me, it's never enough. Her words stuck with me. They reminded me that no matter how much I did, my mother-in-law might never see me differently. Still, I couldn't stop myself from trying, maybe not for her, but for my own sense of worth. That Saturday, Michael's family invited us to a neighborhood barbecue. I almost said no, but Emily was excited to go. I spent the afternoon smiling through conversations, answering polite questions from neighbors, and keeping a careful distance from my mother-in-law. But near the end of the evening, she found me. You know, she began sipping her lemonade like it was fine wine. "I heard they're hiring full-time at that grocery store down the street. Good benefits, too. You should think about applying." It wasn't even subtle this time. She wanted me to have a job she could point to, something that looked respectable in her eyes. Never mind that my current work had purpose or that I was balancing more than she ever saw. I just smiled politely and said, "I'll think about it." Because in that moment I realized something arguing with her was like shouting into the wind. I could waste my breath, or I could save my strength for the day when my actions would speak louder than any defense I could give. I didn't know it then, but that day was already on its way, carried by a storm none of us could see coming. If you'd like, I can go straight into part 3, where the first public humiliation happens, and Claire starts realizing the damage is spreading beyond just family gatherings. That's where the emotional tension will deepen. Banja Noi. Start from part 3. Write 1,200 words. Each essay ChatGPT Janoi got it. We'll start from part 3 and expand to about 200 words each, so the tension and emotional layers have room to breathe. Part 3. The barbecue should have been the last time I saw my mother-in-law for a while, but fate had other plans. A week later, I found myself standing in the middle of our town's community hall, a place that had always felt like neutral ground. It was the monthly neighborhood gathering, a mix of a potluck, a fundraiser, and a gossip exchange. I'd been part of the planning committee for months, making sure the tables were set up, the raffle tickets printed, and the local choir had their microphones ready. It was the kind of work I enjoyed, not glamorous, but it gave me a sense of connection and purpose. Michael had offered to help set up chairs, but at the last minute, he remembered he had to take his car to the shop. I didn't even bother arguing. It was easier to just do things myself. I was in the middle of arranging donated pies on a long table when I heard her voice behind me, sharp, clear, and carrying across the hall like a bell that demanded attention. "Oh, Claire," she called in that syrupy tone she used when she was about to say something sweetly cruel. "You certainly have plenty of time to help out here, don't you?" I turned, smiling politely. "I try to make time for the community." She stepped closer, her perfume heavy and floral, filling the space between us. "It's nice. All this volunteer work. Of course it's easier when you're not tied down by a real job, isn't it?" Several heads turned. I could feel the weight of people's glances, neighbors, acquaintances, people who'd seen me hustling at the community center every week. One woman chuckled awkwardly, like she didn't know whether to agree or deflect. I felt my cheeks flush, but my voice stayed steady. "I actually work here part-time," I said, keeping my tone light. "It's a job, not just volunteering." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes gleamed with the thrill of the audience. "Oh, of course. But I'm sure Michael's income covers everything important. You're lucky to have that safety net. Not every woman can afford to treat work as optional." I knew exactly what she was doing, framing me as someone who had the luxury of not pulling her weight. And she was doing it here in public, where the sting would last longer. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. I forced myself to keep arranging the pies even as my hands trembled. "I suppose we all contribute in different ways," I said. She gave a small laugh. "Yes. Some of us contribute directly, others in spirit." It was the kind of remark that lodged itself in your chest and stayed there. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, but instead of giving her the reaction she wanted, I turned away and walked toward the kitchen, telling myself I had more important things to do. Inside, I leaned against the counter, breathing slowly. Janet was there, pouring lemonade into plastic cups. She gave me a look, half sympathy, half admiration. "You didn't bite," she said quietly. "I wanted to," I admitted. "But if I do, I'm the one who looks bad." Janet shook her head. "Sometimes not reacting is the best revenge. But I hope you're keeping score, Claire, because I have a feeling one day you're going to cash it all in." Her words planted a seed in my mind. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I busied myself with cleanup, avoiding long conversations. But every time I passed someone, I felt the subtle shift in their expression, the flicker of curiosity, the shadow of judgment. The next morning, Michael noticed I was quieter than usual. Over breakfast, he asked, "What happened last night?" "Your mother," I said simply. He sighed, setting down his coffee mug. "What did she say this time?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," I replied, "but she said it in front of half the neighborhood." Michael winced. "Claire, I know it's hard, but she's just like that. She doesn't mean to—" "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't tell me she doesn't mean it. She knows exactly what she's doing. And you letting it slide every time just makes it easier for her. The silence that followed was heavier than usual. Michael didn't argue, but he didn't defend me either. It was as if he'd decided his role was to keep the peace at any cost, even if it meant letting me take the hits alone. By the time I left for work at the community center, I'd made up my mind about something. I wasn't going to keep waiting for him to defend me. I wasn't going to keep hoping she'd change. I was going to focus on my own lane, on building something that was mine that no one could take away or belittle. And yet, there was a part of me that still wished she'd see me for who I really was. Not because I needed her approval, but because I wanted the truth to be undeniable. That truth was going to get its chance sooner than I thought. It started small, a missed appearance at one of her bridge games, a canceled lunch with friends. At first, people thought she was just tired. But then came the day she didn't answer her phone for hours, and when Michael went to check on her, he found her slumped on the couch, pale and shivering. She was taken to the hospital that night, and the diagnosis would change everything. If you want, I can move right into part 4 at 200 words, where Claire's daughter overhears the damage and the emotional stakes rise even higher. This is where the insult stops being just between adults and begins shaping the next generation's view. Would you like me to proceed? Ban Janoi continue ChatGPT Janoi Part 4. When I heard the news that my mother-in-law had been taken to the hospital, my first reaction wasn't triumph, it was dread. I'd never wished her harm. Yes, she had been cruel. Yes, her words had cut deep. But the thought of her lying there, frail and unguarded, felt wrong. Michael rushed to the hospital that night and stayed until visiting hours ended. I stayed home with Emily partly because it was late and she had school the next morning, but also because I needed time to think. The next day, Michael filled me in over breakfast. "It's not life-threatening right now," he said, rubbing his forehead, "but it's serious. Heart issues. The doctors want to run more tests." I nodded. "What do they need from us?" "They'll probably need someone to be with her during some of the appointments. And she might need help around the house for a while." I stirred sugar into my tea, choosing my words carefully. "And you're assuming that's going to be me?" Michael glanced up, caught off guard. "Well, I mean, you're the one with the flexible schedule." Flexible. That word made my jaw tighten. Flexible was what people called it when they assumed your time was free for the taking. Emily, who had been eating her cereal quietly, suddenly looked up. "Why does Grandma always say you don't work?" The spoon froze in my hand. "What do you mean, honey? She told Mrs. Jenkins at the barbecue that Daddy takes care of everything because you don't have a real job." I heard her. Emily's small face was curious, not accusatory, but her words felt like a knife. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Emily?" "No," I said softly, holding up a hand. "It's okay. I'm glad you told me." I turned to her, my voice steady. "Sweetheart, I do work. I work at the community center and I also work from home. I help pay for your school trips, your clothes, and other things we need. Grandma just doesn't always understand the kind of work I do." Emily's brow furrowed. But why would she say something that's not true? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Sometimes people believe things because they've decided not to see the whole picture. It's not about the truth. It's about what they choose to think. Emily seemed to accept this, turning back to her cereal. But inside I was reeling. It was one thing for my mother-in-law to humiliate me in front of neighbors. It was another for her words to seep into my daughter's mind, shaping how she saw me. That afternoon, I sat at my desk in the community center trying to focus on grant applications, but Emily's question kept replaying in my head. Why would she say something that's not true? It hit me then. This wasn't just about pride or dignity anymore. This was about legacy, about the story my daughter would carry forward about her mother. When I finished my shift, I stopped by the hospital. I didn't call ahead. I didn't bring flowers. I just walked in, signed my name in the visitor log, and made my way to her room. She was sitting up in bed wearing one of those faded hospital gowns that made everyone look smaller. The TV was on, but the sound was muted. Her eyes flicked up when she saw me, surprise flashing across her face. "Claire." "Hi," I said, stepping inside. "How are you feeling?" "I've been better." She admitted, her voice less sharp than usual. Illness had a way of sanding down even the hardest edges. I set my bag on the chair. "Michael told me about the tests. I thought I'd come by and see if you needed anything." She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I'm fine." The air between us was heavy with unspoken history. For a moment, I thought about bringing up Emily's question about demanding to know why she'd felt the need to undermine me even to strangers. But something stopped me. Instead, I said, "If you need someone to drive you to appointments, I can arrange my schedule." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she couldn't quite reconcile my offer with the years of friction. "You'd do that?" "Yes," I said simply, "because it's the right thing to do." She didn't respond, just looked at me for a long moment. And in that silence I saw something I hadn't seen before, a flicker of doubt in her certainty about who I was. When I left the hospital, I didn't feel vindicated. But I did feel something shifting. Slowly, subtly, the narrative she'd built about me was starting to crack. That night after Emily went to bed, I told Michael about my visit. "She seemed surprised," I said. "Like she didn't expect me to help." Michael smiled faintly. "She's stubborn, but maybe this will soften her." I wasn't holding my breath. Years of being branded as a burden weren't going to vanish overnight. But now I had a new reason to stay involved, not for her approval, not for Michael's peace, but for Emily's understanding of the truth. Because one day when she looked back, I wanted her to remember that her mother didn't disappear when things got hard. She showed up, even for someone who'd spent years tearing her down. And deep down, I knew that showing up would become the turning point in this story, one that would eventually force my mother-in-law to see me in a light she'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. If you want, I can move into part 5 at 200 words, where the breaking point arrives, and Claire is forced into a direct confrontation with her mother-in-law, laying the groundwork for the bigger shift in their dynamic. Would you like me to continue? Ban Janoi. Continue ChatGPT Janoi Part 5. The breaking point came faster than I expected. It had been a week since my mother-in-law was discharged from the hospital. She'd been ordered to rest, to avoid stress, to eat healthier. Michael and I took turns checking in on her, but the unspoken truth was that most of the responsibility was falling on me. I didn't mind the practical tasks, making sure she had her medication, tidying her kitchen, driving her to follow-up appointments. What I minded was that even in her fragile state, she seemed unable to let go of her habit of taking small, precise jabs at me. One Thursday morning, I arrived at her house with a bag of groceries, lean meats, fresh vegetables, and the low-sodium snacks her doctor had recommended. She was sitting in her recliner, the TV murmuring in the background. "You didn't have to spend money on that," she said as soon as I set the bag on the counter. "Michael already does enough." I straightened slowly, keeping my voice calm. "It's not just Michael. I can contribute too." She gave a little huff. "Well, I suppose if you want to feel useful." I froze for a second, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Feel useful? As if everything I'd done up until this point had been nothing. "Is that really what you think?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes flicked up from the TV. "I think you've had it easier than most women. You don't work full-time. You've had plenty of help with Emily. You've been comfortable." I took a slow breath, feeling something in me snap, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, dangerous way that meant I'd finally had enough. "Do you know what my days look like?" I said. "I get Emily ready for school. I work at the community center helping people who don't have anyone else to lean on. I come home, I cook, I clean, I help with homework. And when everyone's asleep, I open my laptop and work for hours so that our bills get paid, without us having to dip into Michael's savings." But none of that counts, does it? Not to you. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on me, but for once she wasn't smirking. You've been calling me a freeloader for years, I continued. You've done it in front of your friends, in front of neighbors, even in front of my daughter. And I've let it go over and over, because I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, you'd see the truth on your own. But you haven't. So here it is. You don't know me. You don't know my work, my sacrifices, or what I've done for this family. The room was so silent I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, she spoke. You think I don't know sacrifice? I didn't flinch. I think you've decided your struggles are the only ones that matter. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at her hands, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something almost vulnerable in her expression. When she finally looked back up, her voice was quieter. When I was your age, I was raising 2 kids alone because my husband walked out. I scrubbed floors, worked nights at a diner, and still came home to cook and clean. No one helped me. No one said thank you. So yes, when I see you working part-time and spending afternoons at home, I see someone who doesn't know how hard it can get. Her words landed heavily, but they didn't erase the years of damage. They did, however, explain something I'd never understood before. Her bitterness wasn't about me. It was about her fear that I didn't understand the weight she'd carried, the constant threat of losing stability. I'm sorry you went through that, I said honestly. But punishing me for not living the exact same struggle doesn't make either of our lives better. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then, with a slight shake of her head, she muttered, Maybe I've been too hard on you. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall she'd built between us. The rest of the visit passed in uneasy quiet. I cooked her lunch, left the groceries in the fridge, and headed home. But that conversation stayed with me all day. That evening I told Michael about it. He listened, rubbing the back of his neck. She told me you came by. She didn't go into details, but she said you were more capable than she thought. It wasn't exactly glowing praise, but it was a step. I knew then that things between us wouldn't change overnight. But I also knew I'd finally said what needed to be said, and from this point forward, I wasn't going to shrink myself to make her comfortable. If she wanted to keep seeing me as the freeloader in her story, that was her choice. But I was writing my own story now, and in mine, I'd already stopped playing the part she'd assigned me. What I didn't realize yet was that her illness would force us into a situation where we'd have to rely on each other in ways neither of us could have imagined. And that's when the real transformation would begin. If you're ready, I can continue with part 6 at 200 words, where Claire begins emotionally pulling away, setting the stage for the dramatic shift once the illness worsens. This is where the quiet revenge starts to take shape. Would you like me to proceed? Ban Janoi. Continue ChatGPT Janoi Part 6. After that Thursday confrontation, something in me shifted. It wasn't explosive. There was no dramatic vow shouted into the rain, no slammed doors, but a quiet turning inward. I stopped trying to win my mother-in-law over. Stopped rehearsing polite comebacks in my head. Stopped hoping Michael would suddenly find his voice and defend me. I began to conserve my energy, redirecting it toward places where it was actually valued. At the community center, I took on more responsibility. I started a weekend program for single mothers, helping them navigate budgeting, job hunting, and accessing local resources. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. The women who came to those sessions looked at me with gratitude, not suspicion. They didn't care how many hours I worked, only that I showed up when I said I would. At home, I still cooked, cleaned, and kept things running, but I no longer rushed to fill in every gap. If Michael forgot to pay a bill, I didn't scramble to cover it without saying a word. If the laundry piled up because no one else touched it, I let it sit. Michael noticed, though he didn't say much at first. One night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, he glanced at me and said, "You've been different lately." "In what way?" I asked. "Just less involved with Mom. Less talkative in general." I shrugged. Maybe I'm tired of putting my hand in a fire and wondering why it keeps getting burned. He frowned slightly but didn't push. The truth was, I was tired of performing, of pretending that if I just worked a little harder or smiled a little sweeter, my mother-in-law would stop seeing me as a drain. Ironically, my pulling back seemed to make her notice my absence. She'd call Michael in the evenings and ask, "Is Claire coming by tomorrow?" or "Why hasn't she been around as much?" Michael would relay these questions to me sometimes, with a hint of curiosity, sometimes with mild reproach. I'd just tell him I was busy with work. And I was. Then came the Saturday afternoon that tested my new boundaries. I was at the community center helping set up for a charity auction when Michael called. "Mom needs a ride to her friend's house," he said. I glanced at the stack of auction flyers in my hand. "Can't you take her?" "I'm at work," he said. "She said she doesn't want to call a cab." I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. "Michael, I'm working too. I can't drop everything to be her chauffeur." He hesitated. "She won't like it." "I'm aware," I said, and hung up before my resolve could weaken. When I got home that evening, Michael was quiet. Finally, he said, "She ended up staying home. She was upset." "I'm sure she was," I replied. "But maybe she'll start realizing I'm not on standby 24/7. He didn't argue, but the line of his jaw told me he didn't entirely agree. In the weeks that followed, my distance grew. I still showed up when it was truly necessary: doctor's appointments, prescription pickups. But I didn't hover. I stopped calling daily to check in. I let Michael handle some of the things I'd been quietly managing before. Oddly enough, it gave me more space to breathe. I started spending my free afternoons taking Emily to the park, visiting the library, or even just sitting with a cup of tea and a book, things I hadn't allowed myself to do without guilt. But then life has a way of testing you the moment you find your balance. One cold Tuesday morning, Michael called me from work. His voice was tight. "Claire." Mom collapsed again. The neighbor found her on the kitchen floor. "She's back in the hospital. This time it's worse." I felt the air leave my lungs. By the time I got to the hospital, she was in the ICU. Tubes, monitors, the steady beep of machines. It was a stark contrast to the sharp-tongued woman who had dominated family gatherings for years. Michael was already there, pale and shaken. "They said she'll need surgery," he murmured. "And after that, she's going to need full-time care for a while. Maybe months." I stared at the floor, my mind a swirl of emotions. Part of me wanted to recoil, to say, "Not my problem." But another part of me, the part that refused to let bitterness define my actions, knew I couldn't walk away. "I'll help," I said quietly. Michael looked at me, startled. "Are you sure?" "Yes. But this time it's on my terms." I didn't spell it out then, but I meant it. I would help, because it was the right thing to do, not because I was expected to, and certainly not because I was trying to earn anyone's approval. That night, after visiting hours ended, I walked to my car in the cold air, my breath clouding in front of me. For years, I'd been painted as the woman who took more than she gave. Now, I was about to step into a role that would prove, perhaps to everyone, perhaps just to myself, that I had been giving all along. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was going to change everything between us. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early, before the bustle of visitors began. The ICU was a world of its own, dim, quiet, and unnervingly still, except for the constant rhythm of machines. My mother-in-law lay propped up in bed, an oxygen tube resting under her nose, her skin pale against the white sheets. She looked smaller somehow, as if the illness had taken not just her strength, but some of the sharp edges I'd grown so accustomed to. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, her eyes widened slightly. "Claire." Her voice was thin, almost fragile. "I didn't expect you this early. I thought you might like some company before the doctors come in," I said, stepping inside. I set a small thermos of homemade chicken broth on the table. "They said you could have clear liquid, so I made this fresh this morning." She eyed the thermos, and for a moment I braced for a dismissive comment. Instead, she nodded. Thank you. It was a small word, but coming from her, it felt significant. Michael arrived an hour later looking exhausted. Between his job and his mother's care, the strain was already showing. When the doctor came in to explain the upcoming surgery, I noticed how Michael's shoulders sagged under the weight of the medical jargon and paperwork. Let me handle some of that, I offered, taking the clipboard from him. I can organize the schedule, talk to the nurses, make sure we know what's needed for aftercare. He didn't argue, just gave me a look of relief. Over the next week, I became the unofficial coordinator. I learned the medication schedule, kept track of her test results, and called relatives to update them. I organized the fridge at her house so that when she was discharged, everything she needed for her restricted diet would be within reach. At first, she was hesitant to let me handle things. When I helped her into a chair for a short walk around the ward, she muttered, "I can manage." But after a few steps, when her knees wobbled, she let me support her without further protest. It was during one of these short walks that the first real crack in our old pattern appeared. "I don't understand you," she said quietly, her voice barely above the shuffle of her slippers. "After everything I've said to you over the years, why are you doing all this?" I met her gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because, whether you believe it or not, we're family." She didn't reply, but her grip on my arm tightened slightly, not out of weakness, but as if she were holding on to something she wasn't ready to name. When she finally came home after surgery, the responsibility of her care became even heavier. She needed daily check-ins, meal prep, help with medication, and transportation to physical therapy. Michael did what he could after work, but the bulk of the daytime care fell to me. And here's the part I never expected. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone between us began to change. She started asking about my work at the community center, not with sarcasm but genuine curiosity. She accepted my cooking without comments about how Michael prefers it this way. Once, when a neighbor dropped by, she introduced me without hesitation. "This is my daughter-in-law, Claire. She's been taking care of me." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed like a small victory. Still, I didn't fool myself into thinking we were suddenly close. There were days when her old habits surfaced, complaints about the soup being too salty or subtle reminders about how she used to manage on her own. But those moments were quieter now, less cutting. One evening, after I'd helped her settle into bed, she surprised me again. "You know," she said slowly, "I always thought you had it easy, that you didn't really understand hard work. But I was wrong. I see it now." I stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ask why it had taken her so long to notice. Another part of me knew that if I pushed, the fragile progress we'd made might crumble. So I just said, "I'm glad you see it." Walking home that night, the winter air crisp against my face, I realized something important. I wasn't doing this to change her opinion of me anymore. I was doing it because I refused to let her bitterness dictate who I was. But whether I'd meant for it to happen or not, my actions were rewriting the story she'd been telling about me for years. And I suspected that before this was over, she was going to have to face just how wrong she'd been. What I didn't yet know was that the moment of reckoning would come sooner than expected. And it wouldn't happen in the quiet of her living room, but in front of the very people she'd once convinced I was nothing but a burden. When my mother-in-law came home from the hospital, I thought the hardest part would be the physical care, the meal prep, the medication schedules, the endless appointments. But I quickly learned that the real challenge was invisible. It was walking into her house every morning knowing I would give hours of my time and energy without expecting or receiving recognition. Michael tried to help where he could, but his job kept him out most of the day. That meant I was the one who learned which chair she liked best for her afternoon rest, how to cut her meat so she could manage without straining, how to time her walks between pain medication and physical therapy. I arrived every day at 9 a.m. with a bag of fresh groceries, quietly swapping out the sugary snacks she liked for the heart-friendly alternatives her doctor recommended. She noticed, of course. "Where are the butter cookies?" she asked one morning as I unpacked the bags. "They're high in saturated fat," I replied evenly, placing a carton of low-fat yogurt in the fridge. The doctor said, "Yes, yes." I know what the doctor said, she interrupted, but she didn't push further. At first, she kept our interactions strictly functional. She would thank me for a glass of water but ignore the fact that I'd just cleaned her entire kitchen. She'd eat the meals I cooked, but never comment on the effort. And honestly, I didn't expect her to. I wasn't here for compliments. But then something started to shift, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. One Tuesday, a neighbor dropped by while I was helping her walk from the kitchen to the living room. He glanced at me, then at her. "Your daughter." I opened my mouth to clarify, but she spoke first. "Daughter-in-law," she said, her hand tightening on my arm for balance. "She's been taking care of me." There was no trace of sarcasm, no backhanded remark, just a simple statement. Later, she even mentioned it to Michael on the phone loud enough that I could hear. Yes, she was here today. Cooked me lunch. Drove me to therapy. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And for someone like her, that was huge. Still, the outside world hadn't seen this change yet. To most of our extended family and her circle of friends, I was still the woman she had spent years portraying as a hanger-on. That opportunity to shift the public narrative came 2 weeks later. She had a follow-up appointment with her cardiologist, and I offered to drive her. On the way back, she asked if we could stop by the church community hall. There was a seniors' luncheon going on, and she wanted to say hello. I hesitated. I knew some of those women, the ones she had once regaled with stories of her lazy daughter-in-law. Walking in with her felt like walking onto a stage in front of a hostile audience. But I agreed. When we stepped into the hall, heads turned. Several people smiled warmly at her, and then their eyes flicked to me with thinly veiled curiosity. I could almost hear their unspoken questions. "What's she doing here? Isn't she the one who—" One woman, Mrs. Barnes, leaned in to give my mother-in-law a hug. "Oh, it's so good to see you up and about. And you brought—" She hesitated, clearly unsure how to phrase it. "This is Claire," my mother-in-law said clearly. "She's the one making sure I'm still around to come to things like this." The words hung in the air for a beat, and then Mrs. Barnes beamed at me. "Well, aren't you a blessing?" I smiled politely, but inside, something twisted. Not out of bitterness, but from the realization that this was the first time in years my mother-in-law had presented me as anything other than a liability. Over the next hour, I helped her navigate the buffet, making sure she had a balanced plate, refilling her tea when it cooled. Every so often, I caught her watching me, her expression softer than I'd ever seen in public. When we left, she was unusually quiet in the car. Finally, she said, "I think they were surprised to see you with me." "I think they were?" I agreed. She glanced out the window. "Maybe I've given people the wrong impression." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was, her opinion of me was shifting because she could no longer deny what was right in front of her. For years she had defined me to others, but now her own actions, her reliance on me, were rewriting that definition. That night, Michael noticed too. "Mom said you came to the luncheon with her," he said. She actually sounded proud. I laughed softly. Miracles happen. But privately, I knew this wasn't about miracles. It was about consistency. About showing up again and again, not for validation, but because it was the right thing to do. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder when the time finally came for her to say the words out loud, the words I'd been waiting years to hear, would it feel like enough? That answer, I would find, was more complicated than I'd imagined. The night that changed everything started with a phone call at 11:47 p.m. I was already in bed, the house silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Michael's phone lit up first, vibrating on the nightstand. I heard him mumble a sleepy hello and then sit upright. "She's at the hospital again," he said, his voice tight. They think it might be a complication from the surgery. I was already pulling on my jeans before he hung up. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road. When we arrived, a nurse told us she was stable but needed to stay overnight for observation. Michael sat with her for a while, then excused himself to make a few phone calls to his sister and the insurance company. That left me alone in the dim room with her. The only light came from the muted glow of the heart monitor, its steady beeping, a reminder that for now things were under control. She opened her eyes and saw me sitting there. "You didn't have to come," she murmured. "I wanted to," I said simply. For a moment she just studied me as if she were trying to see something she'd overlooked before. Then in a voice that was both hesitant and uncharacteristically soft, she asked, "Why do you care?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was cruel, but because it was genuine. "Because you're Michael's mother," I said after a moment. "Because you're Emily's grandmother. And because, despite everything, your family." Her gaze dropped to her hands, frail and pale against the blanket. "I've been unfair to you," she admitted quietly. It was the first time I'd ever heard her say anything like that. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let her words hang there, giving her the space to continue. "When Michael married you, I thought he was taking on someone who would make his life harder. I thought you'd lean on him the way I had to lean on people when I was younger. And I hated that feeling of needing someone. I didn't want that for him." I sat back, absorbing her confession. "So you assumed I'd be like the people who let you down?" She nodded faintly. "I judged you before I ever really knew you. And once I decided who you were, I didn't want to be wrong." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for the first time I saw the full weight of her pride, not the sharp cutting kind I'd felt for years, but the brittle defensive pride of someone who had built a wall so high they forgot what it was protecting. "I'm not perfect," I said softly, "but I've always tried to carry my share. Maybe you couldn't see it because I didn't talk about it much, but I've been here doing my part all along." Her eyes met mine, glistening in the low light. "I see that now." We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the rhythmic beep of the monitor. Finally, she said, "I don't know if I can undo the way I've treated you, but I'm sorry." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't poetic or dramatic. But it was real. And strangely, I didn't feel the surge of triumph I'd once imagined I would. I didn't feel vindicated or victorious. What I felt was relief. The tension I'd carried in my chest for years loosened just a little. Michael returned a few minutes later, and she didn't repeat what she'd said. That was fine. Some conversations weren't meant for an audience. I stayed until she fell asleep, then quietly slipped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was mostly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Driving home, I thought about how many years I'd spent waiting for her to acknowledge me. And now that she had, I realized the real victory wasn't in her apology. It was in the fact that I'd managed to hold on to myself without letting her bitterness turn me into something I wasn't. But I also knew this wasn't the end. An apology was a beginning, not a conclusion. And I had no idea yet how the rest of the family would react when they began to see the changes in her and in me. That reckoning was coming, and it was going to happen in the one place she'd once torn me down most effectively in front of everyone. 2 days after that late-night conversation in the hospital, my mother-in-law was discharged again, this time with an even stricter care plan. The doctors had been clear she needed rest, a low-stress environment, and no skipping medications. I drove her home myself. It was a gray, damp morning, the kind where the clouds hung so low it felt like the sky was pressing down on the rooftops. She sat in the passenger seat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Halfway through the drive, she spoke without looking at me. "You probably think I've been cruel for no reason." I kept my eyes on the road. "I think you've been defensive. And I think that defense has hurt me more than you realized. She nodded slightly as if agreeing but not yet ready to go deeper. It wasn't just about you. It was about me. I glanced at her, sensing the crack in her usual armor. What do you mean? She sighed, her gaze fixed on the rain-speckled window. When I was 23, I married your father-in-law, thinking we'd have the kind of life you see in magazines. Steady home, steady income children who never wanted for anything. Instead, I got a man who couldn't keep a job and who left without warning when Michael was 9. I was humiliated. My family said, "We told you so." The neighbors whispered, and I was left with 2 kids, a mortgage, and no idea how to survive. Her voice wavered, but she kept talking. I worked every job I could get, cleaning offices at night, cooking at a diner in the mornings, sewing clothes for extra cash. I never slept more than 4 hours a night for years. And the whole time I promised myself I would make sure my children never had to depend on anyone the way I had. The pieces began to click into place in my mind. So when Michael married me, you weren't what I pictured for him, she admitted. I thought he needed someone with a stable full-time career. Someone who could match him paycheck for paycheck so he'd never have to shoulder what I did. And when you didn't fit that picture, I assumed the worst, that you were content to let him carry more than his share. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, fighting the urge to snap back. You never asked. You never gave me a chance to explain. No, she said softly. I didn't. Because I was afraid that if I looked too closely, I might see myself in you. And I didn't want to remember how powerless I'd felt back then. That last sentence hit harder than I expected. We drove the rest of the way in silence. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that her fear had turned her into the very kind of person she resented, someone who judged and diminished others without understanding their reality. But another part of me understood. When we got to her house, I helped her inside and settled her into the recliner. As I was making her tea, she spoke again. I'm not excusing it, Claire. I know I've been unfair, but I want you to understand it was never really about you. It was about the life I didn't want my son to repeat. I set the tea in front of her. I understand, I said, and I meant it. But understanding doesn't erase the hurt. It's going to take time. She nodded. I know, and I'm willing to try. In the days that followed, her attitude toward me continued to soften. She started thanking me more often, not just for big things like driving her to appointments, but for small things too. A cup of tea, a folded blanket, a reminder to take her pills. One afternoon when I brought Emily with me, I overheard her telling my daughter, "Your mom works harder than anyone I know." The words were simple, but I felt them like a balm on an old wound. Still, I knew the real test would come when the rest of the family saw us together again. My mother-in-law had spent years shaping their perception of me, and those kinds of reputations don't dissolve easily. That test came sooner than I expected at the upcoming family gathering she insisted on attending, despite her recent health scare. She said it was just to show everyone I'm still alive and kicking, but I knew there was more to it. And I had a feeling this gathering was going to be the moment when the story about me, her story about me, would finally be rewritten in public. The family gathering was set for a Saturday afternoon at Michael's sister's house. It had been months since I'd been in the same room with all of them at once, and the idea of it stirred a mix of anxiety and curiosity in me. For years, these gatherings had been minefields, every conversation a potential setup for a subtle dig or a joke at my expense. And more often than not, the sharpest remarks came from my mother-in-law herself. But this time felt different. She was still recovering from surgery, and the effort it took just to get dressed and out the door was visible in the careful way she moved. I picked her up that morning, helping her into the car with her cane and the tote bag she insisted on bringing. Stuffed with her medications, a cardigan, and a tin of the oatmeal cookies she'd baked the night before. As I buckled her seatbelt, she looked at me and said, "I want to set the record straight today. The words made me pause. About what her eyes met mine steady despite the fine tremor in her hands. About you. I didn't answer right away. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I started the car and we drove in silence. When we arrived, the house was already bustling. Michael's sister Donna greeted us at the door, her eyes widening at the sight of me supporting our mother-in-law by the arm. "Oh, you came together," she said, surprise coloring her voice. "Yes," my mother-in-law replied before I could. "Claire's been making sure I get where I need to go." We stepped into the living room where cousins, uncles, and family friends had gathered around trays of food. The familiar smell of roast beef and garlic bread filled the air. And as always, the murmurs started almost immediately, little side glances, quick exchanges. I could almost hear them. "Isn't that the one she said never helps with anything? Looks like she's playing nurse now." During lunch, I stayed busy helping serve plates, fetching extra napkins, making sure my mother-in-law was comfortable at the end of the table. I kept my head down, letting the conversations flow around me. But then it happened. Donna leaned over to my mother-in-law and asked loud enough for others to hear, "So how's the recovery going? You must be glad to have Michael around to help." Before the answer would have been a pointed, "Yes, thank goodness," for my son, with an unspoken, "God knows Claire isn't much help." Instead, my mother-in-law straightened in her chair. "Michael's been wonderful," she said, "but Claire's the one who's been here every single day. I wouldn't be where I am without her." The chatter at the table dimmed, heads turned. She wasn't done. "You all know I've said things in the past, things about her not pulling her weight. I was wrong. It felt like every fork froze midair. She's been cooking for me, driving me to appointments, making sure I take my medicine, even cleaning my house. And not because anyone told her to, because she wanted to. I owe her more thanks than I can ever give." I sat very still, my face calm, but inside I felt a dozen emotions tumbling over each other: shock, relief, the faintest flicker of vindication. Donna blinked clearly, taken aback. "Well, that's good to hear." Around the table I caught a few subtle nods, a couple of surprised smiles. And in that moment I realized something important. It wasn't just her opinion of me that was changing, it was the whole family's. The rest of the meal passed in a strangely quiet harmony. There were no digs, no side comments, no passive-aggressive remarks. When I got up to refill drinks, Donna's husband offered to help. One of the cousins asked about my work at the community center, genuinely interested instead of patronizing. After dessert, as people began to gather their coats, my mother-in-law touched my arm. "Walk me to the car." Outside, the winter sun was low, casting a golden light across the driveway. She leaned on her cane, her pace slow but steady. "I meant what I said in there," she told me. "It was overdue." I looked at her, the weight of years between us hanging in the air. "Thank you," I said quietly. She gave a small smile, tired but real. "I still have my ways," she admitted, "but I'm trying." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed her. Driving home, I thought about how strange it was that this moment, the one I'd imagined for so many years, hadn't come as a triumphant victory, but as something gentler. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about finally being seen. What I didn't realize then was that our relationship still had one more test ahead, one final turn that would bring us to the place where forgiveness, regret, and closure would all collide. The weeks after that family gathering felt almost unreal. For the first time in years, visits with my mother-in-law didn't come with a knot in my stomach. We had found a rhythm: quiet mornings over tea, short walks down her street evenings, where we watched old cooking shows together without exchanging a single sharp word. Michael noticed the difference too. "It's like night and day," he said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "I don't know what changed, but I'm grateful." I knew what had changed. She had finally allowed herself to see me as I was, not as the shadow of her fears, and I had let go of the idea that her approval was something I needed in order to feel whole. But fragile things are easily broken. It was late February when I got the call. I was at the community center sorting boxes of donated clothes when my phone buzzed with Michael's name. "It's Mom," he said, his voice sharp. "She's back in the hospital. It's serious this time. They think it's pneumonia, and with her heart condition." He didn't finish the sentence. I dropped everything and drove straight there. When I walked into her room, the sound of her labored breathing filled the space. She looked pale, her hair damp against her forehead, an oxygen mask covering her mouth and nose. The sight of her like that, so vulnerable, so human, hit me harder than I expected. Michael was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets. "They've got her on antibiotics and oxygen," he said quietly. "The doctor says the next 48 hours are critical." I moved to her bedside and took her hand gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw me, they softened. She tried to speak, but the mask muffled her words. "Don't talk," I told her. "Just rest. I'm here." Over the next 2 days, I barely left her side. I read aloud from her favorite magazine, spooned broth into her mouth when she had the strength, and sat with her through the restless nights when sleep wouldn't come. There were moments when she would drift in and out her hand, finding mine in the dark without even opening her eyes. On the third night, her condition worsened. The nurse pulled me aside, explaining that her heart was under strain. "If she doesn't improve by morning, we may need to consider more aggressive interventions," she said gently. That night around 2 a.m., she woke suddenly. The room was dim, the beeping of the monitors steady. She reached for me, her hand trembling. "Claire," she whispered when I leaned close enough to hear. "I'm here. I need to tell you, before it's too late." Her voice was ragged, each word pulled from somewhere deep inside. "I wasted so many years, pushing you away. I see now how wrong I was. I'm sorry. Not just for the things I said, but for the way I made you feel in your own family." My throat tightened. I'd imagined this moment for so long, but I never pictured it happening here in the middle of the night in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. "I forgive you," I said softly, because I meant it. Not because she had suddenly become perfect, or because the years of hurt had vanished, but because holding on to that bitterness had already taken too much from both of us. She closed her eyes, a faint smile curving her lips. "Thank you." The next morning, the doctors reported a slight improvement. It wasn't a miracle recovery, but it was enough to pull her back from the edge. Over the next week, she regained strength slowly, her breathing easing, her voice growing steadier. When she was finally discharged, I brought her home again. As I settled her into her chair, she caught my hand. "Whatever time I have left," she said, "I want it to be different. No more pretending I don't see what you do for this family." I nodded, my eyes stinging. "Then let's make it different." And we did, at least for a while. We fell into a quieter, kinder way of being with each other. But there was a part of me that knew our story was moving toward its final chapter, and that it wouldn't wait for us to be ready. Because the truth was, her health was still fragile, and time had its own plan. The final conversation between us came on an evening so still, it felt as if the world outside had paused to listen. It was early March, a week after my mother-in-law had come home from the hospital. The last traces of winter lingered in the air, the kind that made the sky fade to a pale gray before the sun had even fully set. I had stopped by after dinner to check on her, bringing along a loaf of fresh bread and some vegetable soup. She was in her recliner, a blanket over her lap, the television murmuring quietly in the background. When I walked in, she smiled softly without the old tension that used to be there. "You always bring food," she said. "I guess it's my way of taking care of people," I replied, setting the bread and soup on the counter. When I came back into the living room, she had muted the TV. "Sit with me a while," she said, patting the chair across from her. I sat expecting small talk. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and said, "Claire, I don't think I've got much time left." The words landed heavy in the room. "Don't say that," I said automatically. She shook her head, her gaze steady. I'm not afraid. I just know. My body's telling me. And before that time comes, I need to tell you some things. I didn't interrupt. I've been thinking a lot about the way I treated you, she began. When you first married Michael, I thought I was protecting him. In my mind, if I kept you at a distance, I could make sure you didn't take advantage of him. But the truth is, I was letting my past decide how I saw you. I let fear speak louder than fairness. Her voice wavered. I know I hurt you. I know I embarrassed you in front of people who mattered to you. And I know I made you feel small in your own family. That was wrong. All of it. I felt the old ache in my chest, but it was softer now, muted by the months of slow change between us. It did hurt, I admitted. For a long time, I wanted you to see me for who I really was. And I hated that you wouldn't. But I've realized I can't go back and fix those years. I can only decide what to do with the ones ahead. Her eyes glistened. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I reached over and took her hand. It felt frail, the bones delicate under her thin skin, but her grip was still strong. You already have it, I said. She let out a breath, slow, almost relieved. Thank you. That's more than I gave you for far too long. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Finally, she spoke again. There's something else. When I'm gone, I want you to know I trust you to keep this family together. You're stronger than you think, Claire. Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. I'll do my best, I whispered. We didn't talk about death again that night. Instead, we turned the TV back on and watched an old movie she liked. She drifted off halfway through her head, tilted back, breathing even and steady. I sat there a while longer, memorizing the shape of her in that chair, the way the lamplight softened her face. When I finally left, I kissed her forehead and said, "Good night." She stirred just enough to murmur, "Good night, Claire." I didn't know then that it would be the last time I'd hear her say my name like that, without bitterness, without edge, just human. It happened 3 weeks later. The call came early in the morning, just as the first light was breaking over the rooftops. Michael's voice on the other end was quiet, almost hollow. "Claire, Mom's gone." I sat there for a long moment, holding the phone to my ear, the words not quite sinking in. When I finally asked. "Early this morning," he said. She was in her sleep. Peaceful. Peaceful. It was the word people always used, but it didn't feel like enough to describe the finality of it. I drove to her house in a kind of fog. The front door was already open, relatives coming and going in hushed tones. I stepped inside and was met by the familiar scent of her lavender furniture polish, a smell I realized I would now forever associate with her. Donna was in the kitchen making coffee for everyone. She hugged me when she saw me, her eyes red. She went so quickly, she said. Michael was with her. I nodded, glancing toward the living room where her recliner sat empty. The blanket I'd tucked around her shoulders the last time I visited was still folded neatly over the armrest. The day was a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and visitors offering condolences. At some point, Michael's cousin pulled me aside. "She talked about you a lot these last few months," he said. "Said you'd been her rock." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. For years, she'd been the source of my deepest frustrations. And yet, in the end, she had chosen to tell people a different story. One closer to the truth. The funeral was held 3 days later, a small service at the church she'd attended for decades. The pews were filled with people who'd known her in various seasons of her life, neighbors, old co-workers, bridge club friends. During the eulogies, I sat beside Michael listening as people spoke about her resilience, her stubborn will, her sharp humor. And then Donna stood up and, to my surprise, mentioned me. In her last months, she said my mother found a kind of peace I don't think she'd had in years, And a big part of that was thanks to Claire, who took care of her when she needed it most. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. This time, instead of shrinking under their gaze, I met it. I wasn't the woman they'd once heard about at gossip-filled dinners. I was the woman who had stayed even when she had every reason not to. After the service, as people milled around the church hall, several came up to me to offer condolences. A few even said they'd heard what I'd done and that it was a beautiful thing. I smiled politely, knowing the truth was far more complicated than they could see in a passing conversation. Grief is never simple. I mourned her, not just the woman she had been in these last softer months, but also the years we'd lost to pride and misunderstanding. I mourned the relationship we might have had if we'd both been willing to see each other clearly sooner. But there was relief too. Not in her absence, but in the knowledge that we had reached a place of understanding before the end. That she hadn't left this world still believing the worst about me. In the weeks that followed, her absence was felt in 100 small ways. The silent phone that no longer rang at inconvenient hours, the empty seat at family dinners, the gap in conversations where her sharp wit would have cut in. One afternoon, I went to her house to help Michael sort through her things. In a drawer by her bed, I found a notebook. Flipping through it, I saw grocery lists, reminders for medications, and then tucked near the back, a single page written in her careful script. Claire is stronger than I ever realized. I hope she knows I see it now. I sat there for a long time holding the page. It wasn't much. It wasn't a lifetime of kindness or the erasure of every hurt. But it was something real, and in its own way, it was enough. By the time we finished packing the last box, I felt lighter. Not because everything had been resolved neatly, it hadn't, but because the truth had finally been spoken both in her words and in her actions. And now it was time to carry that truth forward into the rest of my life. The days after my mother-in-law's passing were a strange mixture of silence and noise. The house felt emptier, yet the memories echoed louder than ever. I found myself walking through rooms that still held her scent, touching the edges of her belongings, as if trying to hold on to the pieces of a complicated past. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the journey we'd taken, the years of misunderstanding, the painful words, and the slow, fragile bridge we had built in the end. It wasn't a perfect story. There were regrets that would never fully fade and wounds that time alone might not heal. But there was also growth. Redemption. A kind of grace I hadn't expected to find. I realized something essential about family: it's not always about blood or perfect harmony. Sometimes it's about showing up when it's hardest, offering kindness even when it's undeserved, and choosing compassion over resentment. Through all the pain, I discovered my own strength, not the kind born of confrontation, but the quiet power of resilience and forgiveness. I learned that standing firm in your truth, even when others refuse to see it, is an act of dignity. I'm not sharing this story because it has a fairy tale ending. It doesn't. But because it's real. Because many of us carry the weight of being misunderstood, undervalued, or unfairly judged by those closest to us. If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this: your worth is not determined by the opinions of others, no matter how loud or persistent. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to keep loving without expectation, without bitterness, until the moment comes when healing can begin. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, or if you've faced something similar, please share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other through the complexities of family and the power of forgiveness. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of resilience, truth, and the courage to reclaim your own voice. Until next time, take care of yourself and remember your story matters.